I never thought this would be my life. A man left to piece together the ruins of a family I worked so hard to build. It all started with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Karen, my wife of 16 years, had been acting distant for months. She'd leave the house dressed impeccably for work meetings that always seemed to run late. Her phone was suddenly glued to her hand, always facing down on the table, and the laughter that used to fill our home seemed to vanish overnight. It wasn't just me who noticed. Our youngest, Emma, once asked me why Mom was always too busy for family game nights. I brushed it off, reassuring her that everything was fine, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The truth came crashing down one evening when Karen left her laptop open in the kitchen. I wasn't snooping. I was just looking for the grocery list we always kept on a shared file. But then I saw the email chain, her flirting with some man named Daniel. The messages were casual at first, but they quickly escalated into something undeniable. Words like, "I can't wait to see you again," and "last night was unforgettable" made my stomach churn. The final blow. A picture of them together at a fancy restaurant I couldn't afford, her hand on his arm, smiling like I didn't exist. When I confronted her that night, she didn't even bother denying it. "He makes me feel alive," she said coldly, as if those words would justify everything. I asked her how she could betray me, betray our family, and she just rolled her eyes, like I was the unreasonable one. "Don't act like I'm the only one unhappy here," she snapped, her voice dripping with condescension. "You've been checked out of this marriage for years." Checked out? Was that her excuse? I'd been working overtime, juggling 2 jobs, trying to save for the kids' college funds, and she called that checking out? She had the nerve to blame me for her decision to destroy our family. But the worst part wasn't even her affair. It was the way she started rewriting history, painting me as some absent, unloving husband to justify her actions. "You've always been so controlling," she claimed, twisting every argument we ever had into proof that she was the victim in all this. "Daniel understands me in a way you never could." I knew then that this wasn't just a mistake she was willing to own up to, it was a choice. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even ashamed. And as I stood there, trying to process the depth of her betrayal, she hit me with the final blow. Maybe it's time we went our separate ways. "The kids will understand." Would they? Would they understand that their mother had traded our family for fancy dinners and empty compliments from a man who didn't know the first thing about real love and commitment? At that moment, I wasn't just losing my wife. I was losing the life I thought we had built together. The divorce process was as cold and calculated as the betrayal that triggered it. Karen wasted no time hiring a lawyer, one of the best in town, of course, courtesy of Daniel. It was obvious she wanted to control the narrative, painting herself as the wronged party while making me look like the unreasonable, bitter ex. Every step of the process felt like a dagger to the heart, not just because of what I was losing, but because of how easily she discarded everything we had shared. She was meticulous, carefully crafting her image as the devoted mother who just wanted what was best for her children. It didn't matter that she was the one who had torn our family apart. To the court, she was poised, charming, and the picture of grace, everything I wasn't in those emotionally charged moments. Meanwhile, I sat across from her in hearings, barely holding myself together, watching her smile and exchange pleasantries with her lawyer as if this was just another business deal. She insisted on full custody of the kids, claiming that my emotional instability made me unfit to be their primary caregiver. That part hurt the most. I had always been there for our children, helping with homework, attending school plays, coaching their soccer games when she was too busy or just didn't care to show up. But suddenly, none of that mattered. Her lawyer painted me as an angry, bitter man, and in a courtroom full of strangers, that was the version of me they believed. The kids were caught in the middle of it all, and I hated that more than anything. Karen was careful to manipulate their perception without making it obvious. She would tell them how much she loved them, how she only wanted to keep their lives stable and happy. And yet, every time I tried to spend time with them, there was always a subtle excuse, a school project, a playdate, or simply that they were tired. At first, I thought they would see through it. I told myself that no matter what Karen said, the bond one had with my children was unshakable. But slowly, I noticed the distance growing. My daughter, Emma, once so close to me, stopped asking for bedtime stories when she stayed at my place. My son, Jack, who used to look up to me as his hero, started shrugging me off with short, clipped responses when I asked about his day. It was as though Karen's influence had seeped into every corner of their lives, quietly erasing me from the picture. Then came Daniel. I had known of his existence for months, but seeing him step into the role I had fought so hard to protect was a new level of pain. He wasn't just their mother's new partner. He was the man they began to call Dad without hesitation. It wasn't his fault, I told myself. He was wealthy, charming, and generous, offering my children things I never could. But it didn't make it any easier to watch. He took them on expensive vacations, bought them the latest gadgets, and made them laugh in a way I hadn't seen in years. For Karen, this was the perfect setup. With Daniel by her side, she could justify her choices as being in the best interest of the family. I became the outsider, the father who was always too busy working or too difficult to live with. None of it was true, but truth didn't seem to matter anymore. The court's ruling was another blow. Joint custody, technically, but it was Karen who made the rules. She decided when I could see the kids and for how long. My weekends with them felt more like visits with strangers than time spent with my own family. They were polite but distant, as if they were fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying time with their father. Karen knew exactly what she was doing. She kept everything cordial on the surface, avoiding outright hostility so she could maintain her image as the cooperative ex-wife. But underneath it all was a quiet campaign to alienate me from the family I had once cherished. And the worst part? It was working. I tried to fight back, to prove that I was still the father they needed, but every effort seemed to backfire. The more I pushed to connect with them, the more they pulled away. Karen had created a world where I was irrelevant, and Daniel had stepped into the void with ease. He wasn't just a replacement for me. He was an upgrade in every way that seemed to matter to them. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt like I had lost far more than my marriage. I had lost my identity as a husband and, more painfully, as a father. My children were still there, physically, but the bond we had shared was slipping further away with each passing day. I would sit alone in my small apartment, staring at the photos of us from happier times, wondering how it had all unraveled so quickly. I tried to remind myself that this wasn't the end, that I could still rebuild my relationship with my kids, but deep down, I feared it was already too late. The first few months after the divorce were a blur of court-mandated visits and suffocating silence. I had envisioned those weekends with my children as a chance to rebuild what had been broken, to prove to them that I was still their father despite everything. But the reality was far more painful than I could have prepared for. When Emma and Jack arrived at my apartment, they carried an air of discomfort that cut deeper than any argument with Karen ever could. They would sit stiffly on the couch, answering my questions with short, rehearsed responses, as if they were just waiting for the weekend to be over. The laughter and warmth that used to define our time together had been replaced by awkward silences and forced smiles. I tried everything to bring back the connection we once had. I planned movie nights, cooked their favorite meals, even set up a small art corner for Emma and a gaming station for Jack. But none of it seemed to matter. They weren't rude or openly hostile. If anything, they were overly polite, which somehow made it worse. It felt like I was hosting guests instead of spending time with my own children. It became clear that Karen's influence was stronger than I had realized. She had subtly rewritten the narrative of our family, casting Daniel as the hero who had swooped in to save them from the chaos I had supposedly created. The kids started mentioning him more and more during our time together. How he took them to fancy restaurants, helped Jack with his basketball practice, or sat through hours of Emma's ballet rehearsals without complaint. I wanted to hate him, but how could I? He was everything they needed in a father: present, attentive, and endlessly patient. In their eyes, he wasn't just stepping in where I had left off. He was doing it better. One weekend, Jack brought a basketball to my apartment and asked if we could practice together. I jumped at the chance, grateful for an opportunity to connect with him. For a moment, it felt like old times. Just me and my son, laughing and playing as though nothing had changed. But then, out of nowhere, he mentioned how Daniel had taught him a new trick shot. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just that Daniel was teaching him, it was the ease with which Jack credited him, as if my role in his life was already fading into the background. Emma, on the other hand, was harder to reach. She was always quiet, always retreating into herself when we were together. I tried asking her about school, her friends, anything that might get her to open up, but she would just shrug or give one-word answers. Once, I caught her staring at a drawing she had made, a picture of our family from years ago, back when we were happy. I asked her if she wanted to talk about it, but she just shook her head and tucked the drawing away. It was Daniel's name that seemed to come up most often in her stories, too. He had bought her a professional art kit and even set up a studio space for her in his house. She spoke about him with a level of excitement I hadn't seen in a long time, and while I was happy she was pursuing her passion, I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest every time she called him amazing or so thoughtful. The moments of rejection were subtle but relentless. Jack once forgot his basketball at my place, and instead of coming back to get it, he told me not to worry because Daniel already bought me a new one. Emma left a sketchbook on my coffee table, and when I brought it to her at school, she thanked me quietly but didn't look me in the eye. These small gestures, or the lack of them, chipped away at the hope I had clung to. Karen, of course, played her part flawlessly. She would send polite, well-phrased messages about the kids' schedules, always maintaining the facade of a cooperative co-parent. But I knew what was happening behind the scenes. The kids were spending more and more time at her house, their lives becoming increasingly entangled with Daniel's. I was a visitor in their world now, a shadow of the father I had once been. The breaking point came one Saturday when I overheard Jack telling Emma that Daniel had promised to take them to a theme park the next weekend. They were both so excited, their voices full of anticipation in a way they never were with me. I stood in the kitchen, listening to their conversation, feeling like an outsider in my own home. I wanted to tell them that I could take them too, that I would have done anything to see that kind of joy on their faces when they were with me. But I knew it wouldn't be the same. Daniel had the money, the time, and the charisma to give them a life I couldn't compete with. And the more I tried to fight it, the more distant they became. By the time they left that Sunday evening, I felt utterly defeated. I sat alone in the quiet apartment, staring at the empty space where their backpacks had been. It wasn't just the absence of their laughter or their presence that hurt. It was the growing realization that I was losing them, little by little, with every passing day. This wasn't the life I had envisioned when I became a father. I had always believed that love and dedication would be enough to hold us together, but now I wasn't so sure. Karen had rewritten the rules, and I was left scrambling to figure out where I fit into their lives, or if I fit at all. It wasn't until months later that I caught a fleeting glimpse of what I had once had with my children. The days had blurred together by then, each weekend visit feeling like a chore for everyone involved. But one afternoon, something changed. Something small, almost imperceptible, but enough to remind me of what I was fighting for. Jack had been unusually quiet all day. He sat on the couch with his phone, scrolling mindlessly, barely acknowledging me. Emma had retreated to the art corner, sketching in her new pad, the one Daniel had bought her. I was trying to make dinner when I heard the sound of something hitting the floor, a basketball rolling across the hallway. When I turned, Jack was standing there, holding the ball he'd brought weeks ago, the one I thought he had forgotten about. He looked up at me, hesitant but hopeful, and asked if I wanted to play. It caught me off guard. For months, I'd been the one pushing for connection, always initiating, always trying, only to be met with resistance. And now, here he was, handing me the opportunity one had been waiting for. I didn't let it slip by. We went outside to the small court near my apartment complex. It wasn't much, cracked asphalt, faded lines, a rickety hoop, but it was enough. For the first time in what felt like forever, it was just the two of us. No distractions, no forced conversation. Just a father and son, playing the game we both loved. He wasn't the same boy I had coached years ago. He was taller now, faster, more confident on the court. But as we passed the ball back and forth, I could see glimpses of the child he used to be, the one who used to look up at me with wide eyes, believing I could do no wrong. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't awkward this time. It was comfortable, natural. When we finally headed back to the apartment, Jack seemed lighter, more at ease. He even laughed at one of my dumb jokes, the kind he usually rolled his eyes at. It wasn't much, but it was something, a spark of the bond we used to share. Emma surprised me that same evening. As I was cleaning up after dinner, she walked over to the fridge, where I had hung up some of her old drawings. She stared at them for a moment before quietly handing me her new sketchbook. I didn't say anything, just took it and flipped through the pages. Her talent had grown so much. Each drawing was better than the last, filled with detail and emotion that I hadn't seen before. I told her how proud I was, how incredible her work was, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the old Emma, the one who used to climb into my lap and ask me to draw with her. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. The fact that she had shared her sketchbook with me, something she hadn't done in months, spoke louder than words. For the first time in a long time, I went to bed that night feeling like I had made progress. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was enough to keep me going. I started to believe, even if just a little, that I could rebuild what Karen and Daniel had worked so hard to dismantle. But, as always, life had other plans. The next weekend, when I picked up the kids, Jack barely said a word to me. Emma avoided eye contact the entire car ride. I tried to ask them how their week had been, but their answers were short and clipped. It was as if the connection we had shared just days ago had evaporated into thin air. I found out why when we got back to the apartment. Jack went to his room and slammed the door, something he had never done before. Emma stayed in the living room, arms crossed, staring out the window. When I asked her what was wrong, she muttered something about how I had made everything harder. I didn't understand at first, but when I pressed her, she blurted out that Karen and Daniel had been arguing about me. Apparently, Daniel didn't like that Jack had asked me to play basketball or that Emma had shared her sketchbook with me. Karen, ever the master manipulator, had used the argument to paint me as the problem once again. According to Emma, Karen told them that I was trying to stir up trouble and that I didn't respect their new family dynamic. I felt my stomach drop. All the progress I thought I had made was undone in an instant, not because of anything I had done, but because Karen couldn't stand the idea of me being a part of their lives. She had found a way to twist even the smallest moments of connection into a threat. The rest of the weekend was strained. Jack barely left his room, and Emma was distant again, retreating to her art corner but refusing to show me her work. By Sunday evening, it was clear that whatever small steps we had taken toward rebuilding our relationship had been erased. As I watched them climb into Karen's car, waving half-heartedly, I felt a deep sense of despair settle over me. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting to stay in their lives. I was fighting against a version of me that Karen had created, a version that my children were starting to believe was real. The thought was unbearable. I knew I had to keep trying to keep fighting for them, but for the first time, I wondered if it was even possible to win. Years passed, and with each one, the distance between my children and me grew wider. I tried everything. Phone calls, letters, surprise visits, but nothing seemed to bridge the gap. Karen's narrative had taken root, and Daniel's role in their lives had solidified. He wasn't just a stepfather anymore. He was their father in every way that mattered to them. By this point, Jack was finishing college, and Emma was building a career in graphic design. I stayed informed about their lives through scraps of information I picked up from mutual acquaintances or their rare, one-word responses to my texts. I held on to the hope that one day they might see through Karen's manipulation, but the hope grew thinner with every missed birthday, every ignored invitation, every polite but distant encounter. Then came the wedding. I found out about it in the most humiliating way possible, through a coworker. It was during a lunch break when she casually mentioned seeing my daughter's engagement announcement on social media. I didn't even know Emma was engaged. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what this meant. I hadn't been invited. That much was clear. After work, I sat in my car, scrolling through Emma's social media, my hands shaking. There it was, a picture of her and her fiancé, smiling under a banner that read, "She said yes." Hundreds of comments flooded the post, congratulating her and gushing over the couple. Not a single mention of me. I was an afterthought in her life, if I existed in it at all. The wedding came and went without so much as a phone call or a courtesy invitation. A friend who attended told me later how beautiful it was. An outdoor ceremony, Emma radiant in her dress, Jack beaming as he walked her down the aisle. Daniel had given the father's speech, a heartfelt tribute to his daughter and the love they shared as a family. Hearing that broke something inside me. I had imagined that moment for years, picturing myself standing by Emma's side, holding her hand as she walked toward her future. Instead, I had been erased from the picture entirely, replaced by a man who had never known the struggles of raising her, never stayed up all night comforting her when she was sick, never cheered her on from the sidelines during her first school play. I wanted to be angry, to call Emma and demand an explanation, but the truth was, I wasn't even sure she would answer. And if she did, what would I say? Would she even understand the depth of my pain, or had Karen's influence buried me so deeply in her mind that I was nothing more than a distant memory, a figure from her past she had no use for anymore? Jack wasn't any different. He had stopped answering my calls years ago, and now the only updates I got about him came from his public posts or the rare comments he left on Emma's pictures. He seemed happy, thriving, and fully immersed in the life Karen and Daniel had built for them. I spent the weekend of Emma's wedding alone in my apartment, surrounded by old photos of our family. I didn't know why I tortured myself with those memories, but I couldn't bring myself to put them away. They were all I had left. I stared at a picture of Emma as a little girl, sitting on my shoulders at the zoo, her face lit up with joy. In another, Jack and I were building a sandcastle on the beach, laughing as the tide crept closer. Those moments felt like another lifetime, like they had happened to someone else. The man in those photos wasn't me anymore. He was a ghost, a reminder of a life I had lost and could never get back. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that this was just how things were now. They had grown up, moved on, created their own lives. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't the natural drift that happens between parents and children. This was the result of years of calculated alienation, of Karen's quiet campaign to erase me from their lives. The pain of losing my family wasn't sharp or sudden anymore. It was a dull, constant ache, a weight I carried with me every day. But something about Emma's wedding brought it all crashing down again. It was the final confirmation that I no longer had a place in their world. For the first time in years, I let myself cry, not out of anger or frustration, but out of pure, unfiltered grief. I wasn't just mourning the loss of my children. I was mourning the loss of myself, of the man I had been when I was their father. As the tears subsided, I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. The life I had built around my children, around the hope of reconciliation, was gone. If I was ever going to find peace, I had to let go, not of my love for them, but of the pain that came with holding on to something I could no longer reach. The next morning, I packed up the old photos and put them in a box. I wasn't ready to throw them away, but I needed them out of sight. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something new. I didn't know what that something was yet, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. In the weeks after Emma's wedding, I found myself grappling with a strange, numbing emptiness. It wasn't the sharp pain of betrayal or the searing anger I had felt during the divorce. It was quieter than that, more insidious, a dull weight that pressed on my chest and made it hard to breathe. I kept myself busy to avoid thinking too much. I threw myself into work, volunteering for extra shifts and projects. I went on long walks, stayed out late, anything to keep from sitting alone in that empty apartment, where silence felt like an accusation. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the memories found their way in. I thought about the days when my children were young, when I was their world and they were mine. Jack tugging on my hand to show me his latest Lego creation. Emma sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, coloring in the lines as I marveled at her creativity. The bedtime routines, the family dinners, the laughter that used to echo through the house. Where had it all gone? How had I lost so much, so quickly? I started questioning everything, not just Karen's betrayal or the choices she made after, but my own decisions, too. Could I have fought harder for my children during the divorce? Could I have been more patient, more understanding when they began to pull away? Was I the absentee father Karen had painted me to be, or was I just a man who had tried his best and still failed? The regret was the hardest part. It came in waves, pulling me under when I least expected it. I would see a father and daughter walking hand in hand at the park, or a family gathered at a restaurant, and the realization would hit me again, that life wasn't mine anymore. It hadn't been for years. Rock bottom came on a Sunday afternoon. I was cleaning out a closet when I found a box of old keepsakes I had forgotten about. Inside were tiny reminders of the life I had lost. Jack's crayon drawings of superheroes, Emma's first ballet slippers, the Father's Day cards they had made for me with shaky handwriting and glitter glue. I sat on the floor, holding those memories in my hands, and for the first time in my life, I truly felt like a failure. Not in my career or my personal ambitions, but in the one role that had mattered more to me than anything else, being their father. The realization left me spiraling. I spent the next few days in a fog, questioning whether anything I had done over the years had made a difference. Did my children remember the bedtime stories, the family camping trips, the moments I had cherished so deeply? Or had Karen's version of me erased it all? One night, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every argument with Karen, every missed opportunity with the kids, every mistake I had made along the way. I thought about calling Emma or Jack, just to hear their voices, but I knew they wouldn't pick up. And if they did, what would I say? That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep living this way. The constant cycle of regret and longing was eating me alive, and it wasn't bringing me any closer to the family I had lost. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to have any chance at finding happiness again, I had to start letting go. It wasn't about giving up on my children. I knew I would always love them, and I would always leave the door open if they ever wanted to walk through it. But I couldn't keep basing my entire life on a hope that they might one day return. That hope had kept me stuck, unable to move forward, unable to heal. I started small. I took down the few remaining family photos that still hung on the walls, replacing them with landscapes and abstract art. I went through old emails and deleted the ones from Karen that still carried the sting of her words. I stopped checking Emma and Jack's social media, knowing it only deepened the ache of missing them. It wasn't easy. Every step felt like a betrayal of the father I wanted to be, the father who would never stop fighting for his children. But I wasn't giving up on them. I was choosing to fight for myself this time. For years, I had let my life revolve around what I had lost. Now, I needed to figure out who I was without them. It wasn't a question I wanted to answer, but it was the only way forward. Letting go of the past was like trying to unlearn a habit that had been ingrained in me for years. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come without moments of doubt and relapse. But slowly, I began to put the pieces of myself back together. Not as a father fighting to reclaim what he had lost, but as a man trying to rediscover who he was. I started by making small changes to my routine. Weekends, once reserved for strained visits with the kids, became an open canvas. I took up hiking, exploring trails I had always been too busy to consider. There was something freeing about being out in nature, surrounded by silence that didn't accuse or remind me of what I'd lost. I signed up for a photography class on a whim, buying a second-hand camera and fumbling through tutorials until I figured out how to capture the world through a different lens. It felt good to focus on something new, something creative. My photos weren't great. Crooked horizons, overexposed skies, but they were mine, and that was enough. At work, I stopped volunteering for every extra shift and started setting boundaries. I had spent so many years throwing myself into my job as a way to escape my personal life that I had forgotten what it meant to work with purpose. Instead of overloading myself, I focused on the tasks that genuinely interested me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt proud of what I was accomplishing. Making friends wasn't easy. The social circles I had once belonged to had faded during the divorce, and it felt awkward trying to reconnect with old acquaintances who had moved on with their lives. But I forced myself to step out of my comfort zone. I joined a local hiking group, attended a few community events, even went to a trivia night at a nearby bar. It was there that I met Rachel. She wasn't someone I was expecting to meet. She wasn't part of my past, didn't know the details of my divorce or the years of heartbreak that followed. She was just Rachel, a schoolteacher with a quick wit and a laugh that could light up a room. We ended up on the same trivia team that night, and though we didn't win, we spent hours afterward talking about everything and nothing. I didn't tell her much about my children or my failed marriage that first night. It wasn't because I was trying to hide it. I just wasn't ready to bring that part of my life into something new. Instead, we talked about books, travel, and how neither of us could remember the capital of Montenegro during the trivia game. We started seeing each other more often after that. At first, it was casual, coffee here, a hike there, but over time, it became something more. She wasn't trying to fix me or fill the void I carried. She was just there, kind and patient, letting me move at my own pace. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: hope. It wasn't a blazing, overwhelming kind of hope, but a quiet flicker, like the first light of dawn breaking through a long night. I still thought about Emma and Jack, of course. That part of me would never go away. But the pain wasn't as sharp as it had been. I had learned to carry it differently, to accept it as part of my story without letting it define me. Rachel and I talked about them eventually. She asked thoughtful questions, never prying, always giving me the space to share what I wanted. She didn't try to offer solutions or tell me it would all work out. She just listened. And for the first time, I felt like I didn't have to explain myself or justify my feelings. My relationship with Rachel wasn't a replacement for the family I had lost, but it was a step toward something new. Something that felt real and honest in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. Little by little, I started to rebuild. My apartment, once bare and impersonal, became a reflection of who I was becoming. I hung up my photos, framed my favorite ones, and even painted the walls a warm shade of blue that reminded me of the sky on a clear day. I stopped measuring my worth by how close I was to Emma and Jack. I stopped torturing myself with questions about what might have been. Instead, I focused on the life I was creating, the small joys I was finding in the present. There were still hard days, of course. Days when I would hear a song that reminded me of our old family road trips or see a father and daughter laughing together and feel the familiar ache in my chest. But those moments didn't define me anymore. They were just pieces of a larger puzzle, one I was still putting together. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking backward. I was looking ahead. And for the first time, the future didn't seem so daunting. As the months turned into years, the ache of loss never truly disappeared, but it softened. It became a quiet hum in the background of my life, something I had learned to live with rather than fight against. I didn't forget Emma and Jack. I never could, but I stopped waiting for their return like my life depended on it. I focused on what I had in front of me and allowed myself to move forward. Rachel became a steady presence in my life. She wasn't just a distraction from the pain. I genuinely cared for her, and she cared for me. We found comfort in each other, not because we were trying to escape our pasts, but because we accepted them. She showed me that it was possible to build something new without erasing what came before. But even with Rachel's support, I couldn't ignore the void my children left behind. Every now and then, I would wonder how they were doing. I avoided social media. It hurt too much to see them living lives I wasn't a part of, but I kept the door open, even if they didn't walk through it. Then, one day, something changed. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sipping coffee on the porch when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emma. Just seeing her name on the screen made my heart race. I hadn't heard from her in years. The message was short. "Hi, Dad. I was wondering if we could meet for coffee sometime. Let me know if you're free." I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, rereading the words, searching for any hidden meaning. It didn't say much, but it said enough. She wanted to see me. After all this time, she was reaching out. I replied quickly, trying not to sound too eager. "Of course. Let me know when and where." We met at a small cafe downtown. I arrived early, nervously checking my watch every few minutes. When Emma finally walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She had grown into a confident, self-assured woman, but there was a nervousness in her eyes that reminded me of the little girl who used to tug on my hand for reassurance. We sat across from each other, the table feeling like a chasm at first. The conversation started awkwardly, full of small talk and long pauses. She told me about her job, her new apartment, and her recent honeymoon. I listened intently, soaking up every detail, even though it stung to realize how much of her life I had missed. Eventually, the conversation shifted. She hesitated, staring down at her coffee cup before finally looking up at me. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said softly. She didn't have to explain. I knew what she meant. She was sorry for the years of silence, for the missed moments, for letting me fade into the background of her life. I didn't blame her. Not entirely. I told her I understood, that I had made my own mistakes, too. We didn't resolve everything that day. There were still gaps between us, years of distance that couldn't be bridged in a single conversation. But it was a start. Jack came next. A few weeks after my meeting with Emma, he called me out of the blue. His voice was hesitant, as if he wasn't sure I'd even answer. He apologized, too, in his own way, and we talked for hours about everything and nothing. Like Emma, he didn't offer a clear explanation for the years of distance, but he didn't have to. Just hearing his voice again was enough. The road back to them wasn't easy. Rebuilding our relationships took time, patience, and more than a few difficult conversations. There were moments of frustration, times when I wondered if it was worth the emotional toll. But every step forward, no matter how small, reminded me of why I had fought so hard to keep the door open in the first place. Karen and Daniel were still in their lives, and I had to accept that. They had become part of the family my children had built for themselves, and I couldn't change that. But I also realized that their presence didn't diminish my role as their father. I was still here, still willing to show up, and that mattered. Rachel was my anchor through it all. She encouraged me to take things slow, to let Emma and Jack come to me on their terms. She reminded me that rebuilding wasn't about erasing the past, it was about creating something new. In time, I found a fragile peace. My relationship with Emma and Jack wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was real and it was growing. I learned to cherish the moments we shared, however small, without dwelling on the years we had lost. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Not because I had everything I once wanted, but because I had found a way to make peace with what I had. Life moves forward, whether we're ready or not. And though the scars of the past will always be there, they no longer define me. I am a father, a partner, and a man who has learned that even in the wake of heartbreak, there is always the possibility of something new, something better. I don't know what the future holds with Emma and Jack, but I know I'll be here, ready for whatever comes next. And for the first time in years, that feels like enough.